This topic is called phytogeography. You probably recognize geography, and we've seen a little bit before this prefix phyto that just refers to plants. So it's basically plant geography, where plants are in the world. Sometimes this discipline is called biogeography. There's not much difference here, just a focus on the plants. And our introductory slide here, this is a plant that's kind of rare in our area. So in Wisconsin, you can find this plant. It's actually a wild yam. And yams are typically something you find a lot more tropical. So Wisconsin, as we'll see, has a lot of interesting distributions, a lot of plants that are found here, maybe not so abundant, but found in Wisconsin. And based on what they're closely related to, we can infer how they got here. Sometimes rather interesting routes. So just a start overview, think about this. Maybe you're familiar with this concept. There is a concept when you buy a plant for your garden known as plant hardiness. And hardiness, you might not have thought much about that before, but this refers to basically how tough the plant is against environmental conditions. And specifically, I usually throw this out to students to tell me what it is. What is the specific thing that these plants are tough against? The most important determinant of the hardiness range is how cold it gets in the winter. So there are plants that can handle freezing, as we've seen. There are plants all throughout the world, including in the coldest parts of the world. Right now, we're still in the winter, and in the northern hemisphere, there are some really cold places that still have plants, some of them alive above ground. So these coniferous forests, for example. And if you're going to buy a plant from a garden store, you want to be able to put something in the ground. A lot of people want to put it in the ground and be able to get it year after year. That means that plant has to survive on its own, basically has adaptations that allow it to survive in harsh conditions. And you can see this basically tracks by parts of the country you would expect to be on average warmer, parts of the country you would expect to have cold winters. And the coldness kind of tracks down also here on the in the west down through the Rocky Mountains. So some of these higher altitudes are also influencing the cold temperatures of winter. So farther north and higher altitude, kind of the big determining factors here. So we have these numbers 1 through 13 for hardiness zone, and then a few subdivisions on there you might be interested in. So if we compare this hardiness zone to temperatures, you can see here, this is the average annual extreme minimum temperature. So it's kind of as a prediction. If you're going to invest in a plant and you want to have it survive outside, then you might have to tally up several years worth of data to figure out, okay, what is the complete worst it would get or the average worst it might get in the winter. And so it is just this one thing. So I think we often think there's many determinants. Sometimes you can boil it down to one limiting factor, like cold winter temperatures that really determine where plants can grow. So we often use this term climate. Climate has major influence on where plants can grow in the world. And just a quick definition here, when we talk about climate, this is the combination of temperature and precipitation. So big influence on where plants grow. And of course, where plants grow, that's going to affect where animals can live. And temperature and precipitation, we just saw the situation where plants would have a hard time growing in really cold winter conditions. Hot summer conditions can also be limiting for plants. So too hot, too cold. And then precipitation, too wet, too dry. These also can be limiting for plants. And this is a snapshot of our whole world and showing temperatures in February. So right now I'm recording this in February in Wisconsin, and we are certainly in this more towards the blue range of colors here, but other parts of the world right now, Southern Hemisphere is quite warm right now. So you can see this, I have a link here, you can follow this this behavior of this pattern of temperatures and precipitation around the world throughout the year. So temperature, now we have precipitation, February, some dry parts of the world, but largely some pretty decent precipitation. So zooming in on Wisconsin, you can see these maps, lots of data out there. So we're in an era where you can just get tons and tons of data, historical data, sometimes up to the minute data of precipitation, temperature, and put this all together. And we have a phenomenal ability to model what is going to happen in in upcoming years, like how how cold is it going to get, how wet is it going to get, and so on. So some of the bigger determinants, as we've seen, temperature, precipitation, and then altitude interacts with temperature a little bit. And sometimes these determinants of maximum temperature of the warmest month. So if you need a single value for a whole year, this is one kind of value you can get. You can also get the minimum temperature of the coldest month, and so on and so on. So you can zoom out from Wisconsin as well. So we talked about basically the environmental conditions, the non-biological conditions that determine where plants can grow. On a big scale, it really comes down to climate. So you can see these patterns that are kind of following more latitudinal lines. So moving farther north, you get these bands of similar plant communities. So I have the labels in here. Boreal coniferous forest. Boreal refers to the far north, coniferous, the gymnosperm trees and shrubs. Down here we have Laurentian mixed forest, so mixed referring to coniferous and deciduous, or they call down here broadleaf. So getting into places that aren't as cold in the winter means you can have more plants that have leaves that stick around. Sometimes they stick around year round, but we also have these deciduous plants that drop their leaves in the winter. And that strategy works pretty well for most of Wisconsin, the northern half of Wisconsin, as the so-called mixed forest. Further south, we have this broadleaf forest. Again, these are really broad patterns, so you might be looking around the area we live in here, and it's not exactly a broadleaf forest in many places. There's also prairie distributed through this area. So it's not universal, but these broad patterns are kind of drawn on here. Prairie, and then I didn't label the other patterns heading farther away from where we're at right now. So the pattern, temperature, big change going north. Precipitation, a little bit of a change where we have kind of a drier Great Plains environment. And that contributes a little bit more to this prairie environment, and so on. So kind of building up where the plants are from where they can grow. One of the big patterns we have in Wisconsin, you could even see it from that previous map, was that Wisconsin and also states in this area, this isn't unique to Wisconsin, but Wisconsin has a very clear split, almost half of the state split between this northern half, sort of northeastern half, and the southern half, the southwestern half, north versus south. And by and large, you can find a lot of plants in the north only, and a lot of plants in the south only. And it's such a pattern across so many species. I've shown some rather good examples here. Not every species has this kind of range ending, but basically we have this pattern where the ends of some northern species, the end of their range, follows this pattern, and the range limit of some southern species also follows that pattern. It's almost like they sort of agree to live in different parts of the state. And so there's this term referring to this called the tension zone. So tension kind of referring to, I suppose, I don't know, warring factions, the big amount of difference in the species as you cross that boundary. So it's not a fixed firm line, but it's sometimes depicted as a wider band here. But what this means is that there are lots of species that don't grow north of that line, and other groups of species that don't grow south of that line. And so it's a useful term. Maybe you've had the pleasure of driving up to northern Wisconsin, and you can see that the habitat types change over quite a bit as you head in that direction. So we have the pattern, the tension zone is really described based on the plant species, and looking for the environmental factor that might be influencing that. This is one here. This is called an isotherm. Again, this is one of these long-term patterns of temperature over years. And as people were collecting the data say that this 70 degrees July temperature, this is about where in July, areas north of here are colder than 70 degrees, and in July, areas south of here are warmer than 70 degrees. That's maybe one of the bigger patterns that matches this tension zone pattern. So the plant pattern and the environment pattern, they match up pretty well. Broader distributions, you can look at bigger groups of plants and see that there are sometimes some patterns based on geography. and in areas you might expect to be influenced differently by climate. So we can head in closer to the equator. We get places that are more continuously warm. And this is an example from the legume family showing different kinds of seeds or beans, dormant versus non-dormant, and the relative distribution of those. And basically it's showing you that there's a different kind of seed produced in these areas that have more warm temperatures relative to these areas that have colder temperatures. So patterns of which species grow there, also the relative adaptations that you need to grow in these areas. Lots of big patterns, lots of individual species concerns, lots to study if you're interested in this kind of thing. All right, so looking at where plants grow, we've seen some big patterns of where you can find different plant species. And it's easy to generalize. We can talk about big patterns, little patterns. For an individual plant species, you might be interested in what factors contribute to its local environment, where you can find it, or patterns that contribute to its broader environment patterns. Just some things to think about here. So the habitats that I'm showing here, a few different kinds of habitats. And you can maybe you've been to a habitat like this, you can kind of envision the conditions in these places. So not all in Wisconsin, but different kinds of habitats. On the left here, we have kind of a moist understory in a forest. You can tell it's fairly moist. We've got lots of mosses and ferns growing in here. And we don't see the trees, but you could maybe get a feel that, or we don't see the tops of the trees, I should say. You get the feel maybe that not a lot of light is getting through. So it's kind of a trade-off of abundant moisture, relatively more abundant moisture, and relatively low light levels. That's going to select for a kind of plant that can grow there. So there are adaptations that would benefit you in that environment. And those are different adaptations, maybe contrasted with this environment that has lots of light exposure. This is an exposed rocky soil area. Lots of light exposure, but also maybe not a lot of water retention in the soil. It looks like a drier habitat. So sun exposure, dry, maybe poor soil, not as many nutrients available there. And so different kinds of plants would grow in these places. So we can see plants in these different habitats, and we can also expect certain plant species to be found in these areas. So I've got an understory, an open light area, and then this one is a wet fen habitat. So open light, but wet soil. And then also a little bit acidic soil might contribute to the pattern we see here. Okay, so pattern determinants here: hydrology, abundance of water in the soil, what makes up the soil. So is it more organic or more rocky mineral? Is it acidic? Is it toxic in any way? How much light is available? And so we can see some of these more distinctive plant species. So I'll just show you some examples. As you get familiar with more plant species, you would get very comfortable, I think, predicting where to find them. So some of these plants are, they have very particular habitats where you can find them. For example, these plants you would find in Wisconsin basically only growing in bogs, or sometimes maybe the sundew here growing into just a general wet habitat. But they have adaptations to help them grow in these places. They have competitive advantages for growing in those areas and completing their life cycles, and all kinds of evolutionary strategies that have come along over the years to help them grow best in these places. Generally means that they're not well adapted to grow in other types of habitats. So this pitcher plant, for example, this is a carnivorous plant, has a strategy for getting extra nutrients in a bog, which is typically poor in nutrients. So I've shown some examples of species that are characteristic of bogs, and then some statewide distributions of where they've been collected from. And there's some patterns that show up. So bogs more distributed in the north of Wisconsin, and then a little kind of patchy. This is a little bit of our glacial relic here. The Kettle Moraine system is kind of in this area. So there's a few bogs in the south that are determined a little bit by the historical patterns, the geologic patterns that created their habitats. Moving out of Wisconsin, you can see that the distribution of bogs has a kind of a northern sort of Great Lakes band, and also a little bit down the coastal plain into the south, so bog habitat types. And we'll talk about basically where these dots came from, but anytime you see dots on a map like this, these are specimens, places where people have found plants of a particular kind. This is one species. I forget what species I used for this one, but it would have been one of these characteristic bog species. Just want to give you a little note that we have these dots a little bit richer in areas close to where people are. So them being rich in this band, this is also where a lot of cities are. And moving north into Canada, these plants may well be very abundant in that area. There's just not that many people to collect them, to collect certainly from all these different places that are far between. So always treat your distribution maps with a grain of salt, I guess. So bog plants, areas in a sandy habitat. So we've got, I don't really need to belabor all these different map types, but within the state, you can see different kind of patterns of where these different species grow. And then I also have these zoomed out maps. So sandy habitats, a little bit more like Great Lakes shoreline is kind of a sandy habitat. There's some dune areas in these areas. And western habitat, so a little bit of this dry western habitat, maybe a little sandy as well. So these broad patterns are known as ecological regions, and these are very similar to what we saw with the tension zone. There's kind of a nice illustration that it's not always perfectly agreed where these boundaries are. So I was drawing you a tension zone that's a lot more diagonal. This boundary is shown splitting more cleanly east-west across Wisconsin. And that's the split between this number 8 and number 5. So number 8, the eastern temperate forests, a big category for this whole zone here. And then moving up to what's called the northern forests. So differentiated not just by being more northern, but also by, of course, having different species. So much more coniferous in this 5 area versus broadleaf deciduous in this area. So I have this question here, determined how. It's a really involved effort, I would say, to decide to put all kinds of data together and say that this is the boundary where one kind of habitat gives way to another kind of habitat. So I think it takes a certain amount of comfort looking at that amount of data and to be able to say, okay, we have species that are mostly found over here, and those species are different from the species that are mostly found in here. But there would be individually a lot of crossover, but broad pattern wise, you can do this sort of to help people understand where you could find different kinds of communities, basically. So patterns, as we saw before, climate is a big determinant. This one I thought was interesting to put on there. This was a map I found of soil pH. So across the country, a little more acidic is in this heading toward red color. So acidic would give you more of those bog habitats, and then a little more alkaline heading toward the west. And that division here, it's a little bit west. Here's the Mississippi River, and west of the Mississippi is not too different from the boundary between 9 and 8 on this distribution map here. So another case where we have the plant boundaries determined, the ecological community types determined using species, and then it matches up pretty well with patterns we see in something like this, like soil type. Another pattern here, we got this red showing up that also traces pretty well with that green habitat of the 6.0. So patterns, if you love patterns, get into map making. All right, so you can zoom out, zoom in. We've seen lots of examples here. I think I probably get a little over, I do a little too much of this, I think, showing you these examples, but this one is meant to illustrate that you can break the big groups down into littler groups. You can have these hierarchical divisions. So this is from the Environmental Protection Agency, and they maintain a lot of these maps. And they got these bigger categories in bold with the solid numbers, the whole numbers. So 50 northern lakes and forests, and then 50 is subdivided into ABC all the way through L. And so you would find overall very similar species, but then maybe between 50J and 50I, you would see a significant turnover in something about the plant community here. So lots of people studying this, lots of organization done. All right, I think we've seen this before. Just another case where I'm showing you a variety of species that are all kind of contributing to this pattern of understanding one kind of habitat. So I've got 4 species in the upper right that are dry prairie species. And if you take these and other species as well and put them together, you get this kind of broad pattern. You can kind of draw maybe a shading of where these are most abundant in the state. More in the southern part of the state, and then pretty good cutoff as you head up into the north of the tension zone area. Again, also some pretty big patterns of cities. We've got Minneapolis, St. Paul here. In Minnesota, we've got Madison, kind of here, Milwaukee, Chicago, and those are where the points are rather dense as well. So big patterns, looking for big patterns.